The first Israeli counterattack in Sinai began with a memory of victory and ran into a battlefield that no longer obeyed it. Israeli tank crews had been trained in a tradition of speed, nerve, and aggressive movement, and that tradition had carried real triumphs in 1956 and 1967. When Egypt crossed the Suez Canal on the 6th of October, 1973, the instinctive answer was to strike back before the bridgeheads hardened. Get armor forward, hit the attackers, break their rhythm, and restore the canal line before the crisis widened. But the Israeli crews who drove west toward the canal were not entering the old desert war. They were entering a prepared Egyptian killing zone, protected by missiles, artillery, infantry, and the psychological shock of surprise. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. In the first hours after Operation Badr began, Israel's forward defense was already coming apart. The Bar-Lev strongpoints were under attack or isolated. Egyptian infantry had crossed in strength, and the sand wall was being cut open by engineers. Israeli commanders needed information, but the reports coming back from the canal were fragmentary and often desperate. Some positions were still fighting, others were surrounded. Roads that had seemed like fast approaches to the water were suddenly routes into ambush. The Israeli army was built around reservists, and that meant time mattered with brutal urgency. Active units in Sinai had to slow the Egyptians until mobilized formations could arrive. Yet Egypt's plan had been designed precisely to make those first Israeli movements costly, rushed, and confused. The earliest counterblows were not one clean, grand attack. They were a series of hurried armored movements toward a front whose shape was changing faster than commanders could grasp. Tanks moved towards smoke, toward radio calls, toward strongpoints that might already be cut off, and toward Egyptian forces that had already dug in beyond the canal bank. Some Israeli crews expected to find infantry still exposed in the open after the crossing. Instead, they found Egyptian anti-tank teams waiting from covered positions, with artillery behind them and air defenses limiting Israeli air support above them. The difference between expectation and reality was deadly. A counterattack depends on timing, but timing depends on understanding what is actually in front of you. Israel was attacking into uncertainty. By the 7th of October, the shock had deepened. Israeli forces in Sinai had taken serious losses, and the canal was not being restored. The Egyptian bridgeheads were growing stronger as more infantry, tanks, guns, and supplies crossed from west to east. Israeli commanders still believed that a powerful armored counterstroke might reverse the situation, because that belief was not fantasy. Israel's armored arm was experienced, technically skilled, and capable of rapid battlefield improvisation. But even an excellent armored force can be squandered if it is pushed forward without infantry support, without reliable reconnaissance, and without a clear understanding of enemy anti-tank defenses. The Egyptians were not chasing Israeli tanks across open desert. They were waiting for them near the canal, where the ground, the weapons, and the plan all favored defense. The crisis reached its most painful form on the 8th of October, when Israel attempted a larger counterattack intended to break the Egyptian lodgements and regain the initiative. On paper, this was the moment when the familiar pattern might reassert itself. Reserve formations were arriving. Commanders were trying to organize their divisions. The Egyptian bridgeheads, though strong, were still close to the canal, and the Israeli army had not lost its capacity for hard fighting. But the operation unfolded under confusion at the top and danger at the front. Orders shifted, intentions were misunderstood, and coordination between formations was weaker than the situation required. What should have been a concentrated blow became a set of attacks that did not strike with one fist. Against prepared defenders, that difference mattered. The men most exposed to that difference were the tank crews. From inside a tank, the battlefield is both protected and terrifyingly narrow. You see through sights and periscopes, hear clipped orders and engine noise, and try to make sense of dust, smoke, flashes, and sudden impacts. Egyptian anti-tank missiles changed the feel of the fight. The Sagar, a Soviet-made guided missile, required skill to operate, but in trained hands it could reach out farther than Israeli crews expected from infantry positions. Rocket-propelled grenades and other close-range weapons added danger where ground was broken or where infantry had slipped forward. Israeli tanks could and did kill Egyptian positions, but many advanced into areas where the enemy had arranged the battle around their destruction. The failure was not because Israeli soldiers lacked courage. That explanation is too simple and unfair to the men on both sides. The failure came because courage was being fed into a system built to consume it. Egyptian infantry did not need to match Israeli tank crews in mobile gunnery duels across miles of open sand. They needed to stay concealed, hold their nerve, and fire when Israeli armor entered the engagement areas. Egyptian artillery helped disrupt movement and command. The missile umbrella overhead complicated Israeli air intervention. The canal bridgeheads gave the Egyptian defense a firm purpose: hold the ground already won and make every Israeli attempt to reach the water bleed. This was not a duel of machines. It was a collision between a mobile counterattack doctrine and a layered defensive plan. At headquarters, the picture was no clearer than it was in the dust. Southern Command, responsible for the Sinai front, was under immense pressure to restore a situation that had deteriorated with shocking speed. The Israeli High Command faced two crises at once because the Syrian attack on the Golan Heights threatened the north, while Egypt pressed in Sinai. Decisions had to be made before the reserves were fully settled, before the enemy's full deployment was understood, and before the old confidence had been replaced by a new plan. In such moments, armies often reach for what they know best. Israel knew armored counterattack. It knew quick movement. It knew aggressive commanders making things happen. But the first days in Sinai showed that doing the familiar thing faster is not the same as adapting. The Egyptian side also had to endure enormous strain. Holding a bridgehead against Israeli armor was not a passive task. Anti-tank teams had to remain in position while shells landed and tanks fired back. Infantry had to resist the instinct to run when heavy vehicles approached. Commanders had to keep ammunition moving, wounded men evacuated, and lines connected to the West Bank. Engineers and bridge crews had to keep the crossing system functioning while Israeli fire searched for weak points. The Egyptian achievement was not simply that Israeli tanks were hit, it was that the bridgeheads did not collapse when Israel struck. After 6 years of preparation, the Egyptian army had done what Sadat needed in the opening phase. It had crossed, held, and made Israeli recovery painfully difficult. The psychological effect on Israel was profound. Since 1967, much of Israeli military confidence had rested on the belief that Arab armies could be overcome by rapid maneuver and bold command. That belief contained truth, but it had hardened into expectation. The failed counterattack broke that expectation in a way no briefing could have done. Tanks burned in Sinai, air support was constrained, strongpoints remained lost or isolated. Egyptian soldiers did not break simply because Israeli armor appeared. The shock was not only tactical, measured in vehicles and positions, but emotional and institutional. Israel was discovering that its enemy had studied its habits and built a battlefield to punish them. For an army proud of improvisation, the first requirement now was humility forced by loss. Yet this episode should not be mistaken for the whole war. The failure of the first counterattack did not mean Israel had lost the Sinai campaign beyond recovery. Israeli forces would learn, reorganize, and eventually exploit the limits of the Egyptian position. Commanders would search for gaps rather than battering directly against the strongest bridgeheads. Armor would again become decisive when used with better timing, better positioning, and a clearer understanding of where the Egyptian system was thin. That later recovery is part of what makes the campaign so compelling. The same army that suffered badly in the first counterattack would later cross the canal and threaten the rear of the Egyptian armies. But none of that erases the importance of this moment. Before Israel adapted, it had to be hurt badly enough to know adaptation was necessary. The first Israeli counterattack matters in the history of armored warfare because it exposed the danger of treating past success as a universal law. Tanks remained powerful, and Israeli tank crews remained formidable, but the battlefield had changed around them. Infantry with guided missiles, artillery tied to prepared defense, air defense networks, and carefully planned obstacles could turn speed into vulnerability. The lesson was not that the tank was finished, a claim that has been made too often and too easily after every painful armored setback. The lesson was sharper and more useful. Tanks used without proper reconnaissance, infantry coordination, artillery preparation, and air freedom can become isolated instruments of hope rather than tools of decision. Modern armor still needed movement, but movement now had to be earned. By the end of the failed counterblows, the canal front had a new reality. Egypt held its bridgeheads east of the water. Israel had failed to smash them in the first rush. The Bar-Lev line was no longer the anchor of the front, and the Israeli army had been forced into the hardest kind of education, the kind delivered by an enemy who has prepared well. The road to Chinese farm begins here, not only because positions were lost, but because assumptions were lost. Israel would now have to find a different answer, one that did not simply repeat the armored habits of 1967. The first counterattack was a defeat, but it was also the beginning of Israeli learning under fire. In Sinai, the old war had finally died, and the next phase would be fought by men trying to understand the new one before it killed them.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.